welcome back, third time this conference, Andreas, Cser. Thank you so much. Thanks for doing another one, man. Really, really appreciate you. Please give him a warm round of applause and let him introduce his panel speaker.
Thank you, Philip. Well, going from how you can build it to maybe how you can fund it, I have the great pleasure to welcome one of Europe's top-performing seed venture capital fund leaders and coaches who's coaching founders and CEOs at Series A to D. He has experienced the full range of CEO life, from sole founder, bootstrapping, all the way to NASDAQ IPO and the 1.9 billion trade sale, as well as the full range of VC investing, starting with acting as a managing director at a 700 million tech fund. Tim's first career was as a journalist with The Economist and the FT in Tokyo, Brussels, and San Francisco, and is the author of 4 business books. He studied philosophy at Oxford, is married to an artist, keeps chickens, grows vegetables, and likes collage and string quartets. Welcome, Tim Jackson. How do early stage companies these days do on the fundraising in London and Europe? And how does that compare also to Silicon Valley? We had somebody from Silicon Valley here yesterday.
Well, I think this is the most incredibly exciting time. And what I'm seeing, and I was discussing this with another speaker in a car on the way over here this morning, is that the gap between the Valley and the rest of the world is narrowing somewhat. And I think that's partly because, as all of you know, information is flowing more quickly and more freely. It's getting a lot easier to learn things fast than it used to be. So I think that while the opportunities around San Francisco are still fantastic, they're increasingly powerful elsewhere.
And what trends do you see today versus maybe coming out of COVID or even pre-COVID? Is there something that's changed? You know, right. The obvious thing being AI, but right. Within that or outside that?
Well, I'd say apart from all the stuff that's been talked about already at this conference, lots of great ideas have been canvassed. I would say there's some big macro things and some micro things. The macro thing, I would say, is that there's been a kind of Moore's Law line in the cost of building a startup. You know, we all know that computers got more powerful by doubling their capacity every year and a half. That's what Gordon Moore discovered at the very beginning of Intel. I think there's been a similar thing happening over the last 20 years with startups, which is that a startup where it used to cost $1 million and take a year to get to an MVP can now be done in a week at a cost of a fraction of that. And what I see is that rate of change appears to be accelerating. It appears to be easier to build something than ever before, and it's getting faster too. And that's incredibly important for anyone who's doing a startup because it changes your thinking about venture capital and changes your thinking about fundraising. Because of course, it's always nice to raise money. It's great to be able to boast to your friends about how much money you have raised from investors. But actually, you have to remember that every time you raise, you're giving away a piece of your company. And therefore, if you can grow the business with less outside capital, that's hugely important. Now, turning something from existent to huge is still very expensive. And therefore, I fully expect the mega funds that are doing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars at a time to continue to thrive and grow. But I think if you're somebody who's at seed stage, who's starting out, it's never been easier or cheaper to do it. So that's the big picture issue. The micro issue is that I, as an investor, observe that the new tools are kind of an arms race in terms of communication between startups and VCs. I decided a few years ago that I thought it was really important to be able to make direct responses to everybody who reached out to us, rather than hiding behind analysts and associates. Because what I know from talking to founders and CEOs is that they really like talking to the general partner rather than talking to someone who's just filling in details in a CRM. So I see all the stuff that comes in, and I use a degree of automation, of course, in order to think about how to respond. What I've noticed in the last three or 4 months is a huge spike in the number of very well-written, cold outreach emails, which contain some specific personal information that it looks like they actually have thought clearly about the match between what they're doing and our fund and the value that I add personally. I suspect that in 90% of those cases, that is in fact bogus and generated by AI, and that's okay, because they're reaching out to lots of people. But we have to recognize, therefore, that there is an arms race going on.
Yeah, it's a good one. Can you name any sort of, or can you narrow on any underhyped sectors or technologies that you think the audience here might be well suited to develop or focus their attention to?
Well, I think the answer is I probably could. It reminds me that I used to have a slogan, which is that our strategy is to invest in the biggest opportunities that are too boring for anybody else to have noticed.
That's the one.
However, I think it would probably be counterproductive if I were to give you a list, because by definition, once you do that, then that hugely increases the interest. By the way, I think there is a useful lesson for you if you're a founder, that it used to be something that many founders really wanted to do, which is to get the validation from launching a product and then seeing it covered in the tech press, such as, for example, TechCrunch. And what I've often said to founders in recent years is that it's very important for you to realize who the readers are of those articles. And my sense is that in most cases, the readers are people who are thinking about what's their next startup going to be and are trying to figure out a product that maybe they should copy or do better. And that's therefore not necessarily the best thing for you to do, to immediately wave a flag to all of those people as soon as you have your first crappiest MVP out there.
That's a good takeaway. What looking back at your career, reaching back all the way to the dot-com bubble and beyond, how important is kind of timing versus luck, and what are your personal conclusions, or what are your conclusions for the audience here to sort of take away?
Well, yeah, I think this is an incredibly important issue, and I think that it's very common if you're starting out as an entrepreneur to look at kind of super famous, super big company founders and to assume that in some way they are a different class of human being from you. And it's quite valuable to realize that that is not the case. Not just because self-evidently we're all human beings, but also because there are an awful lot of exceedingly smart and hardworking people who did not make $1 billion or $10 billion or $100 billion. And that's because an awful lot depends on the state of the world when you were starting and the match between what you happened to be doing and the moment that you arrived in. And I think it's very valuable for exited founders in particular to recognize that a large chunk of their good fortune came from the timing or came from chance. And that's, I think, somewhat undervalued.
And what's the conclusion? Is it then to just let chance happen, or what's the sort of real kind of encouragement for the people here?
I think the conclusion is this, and it's a little bit like the line that was quoted by that very smart guy from GitHub, where he talks about it's like climbing a mountain that has no top. The important thing, as I see it, is to recognize that there is a crucial differentiator between you and other people. That many other people, when things get difficult, are likely to give up. I, for example, found that after the IPO of my startup, there was a lot of media coverage about how it had been it was now worth a few $1 billion, and lots of people said, "Oh, that doesn't sound so complicated. I could have done that." And the interesting thing is, of course, that they didn't do that. And it's all very well to say, "Yeah, that was easy. I could have done it," if in fact you just carried on with your day job. So I think the message for you, if you're involved in a startup, is to realize that showing up and continuing to make an effort is incredibly important. And that also, despite the impression that you might get from looking at the media coverage, actually running businesses is hard. It's often unrewarding. It's often scary. It's often depressing. And working through those difficult moments matters a lot.
just staying in the past and comparing the past to today, is there and given 25 years perspective, is there any sort of insight, maybe not entrepreneurial related, maybe technology related, that applied then that kind of still applies today? Is there? Can we compare the AI hype to Internet 1.0 hype, and is it going to all crash after the S-curve is achieved at the top?
Well, of course, there's a huge amount of hype right now. And what I would say is that today is an extraordinarily good time to be launching an AI startup as a founder, because it's a seller's market, because the valuations that are being set, the prices that are being paid for early stage AI businesses are extraordinarily high and extraordinarily advantageous if you're a founder. And even though we as an industry in venture capital are tremendously optimistic, I think many venture capitalists are actually terrified because they're thinking the prices that they're paying are truly scary.
But is it comparable to the dot-com
yes.
boom? Are we sort of in danger of kind of having a rude wake up like we did in 2001, 2, 3?
So I think we were having a conversation about this over dinner last night, and I know that, Andreas, you are actually a little bit scared about the general state of valuations of equities, and you're thinking this might be a time to be a contrarian. And that's a thoroughly defensible point. What I would say is this: I think there are some things where the hype ratio might be 10 or 20 or 30%, and there are some things where the hype ratio might be 80 or 90%. And so if we look back over the last 25 years, there's a case for saying that, over longer, there's a case for saying that the 4 big changes in technology were 1, the personal computer, 2, the internet, 3, mobile computing, and 4, AI. All 4 of those things are real. All 4 of those things are things that are huge, have huge potential to increase human productivity and human happiness and human wealth. And ultimately, companies that provide services and products that facilitate those changes are likely to make great returns for their shareholders. I think crypto, for example, is much more controversial. There's some serious questions about whether separating finance from central banks is of anything comparable in value to those 4 things. So I would say, yes, there could be a high element of hype, but yes, even more, there's some really important value there.
Let's stick to AI for a second. We were talking yesterday here with a previous speaker about where it's going, and we identified kind of 4 groups. The AI optimists, the AI pessimists, the AI scientists, and the AI tinkerers. Which one do you kind of agree with most, or which one do you see this going towards?
Well, I would put myself in 3 out of those 4 categories. I am an AI optimist and an AI pessimist, and I'm also an AI tinkerer, but I'm definitely not an AI scientist. I'm an optimist because 2 things seem clear to me. One is that there is already huge value in the LLMs today. And anybody who is not finding that they can save themselves time and make themselves more productive with the AI products that are out there today, I would suggest simply isn't looking hard enough. And I find that when I talk to people who consider themselves skeptics, often the situation is that actually they don't really know what it is, or they're regurgitating back to you things that they heard 18 months ago about the kind of hallucinations that happened. Now, on the pessimism side, here's a tiny nugget. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning which talked about AI sycophancy and the fact that the AIs are increasingly responding to their users by, as it were, giving positive affirmation of stupid or incorrect things that their users say. I think that's just one small example of bad things that can happen with AI, and I think that the risk of an AGI that takes over the world and kills us all is actually serious. I don't know enough about the technology to know when that will happen, whether safeguards can be put in place, or what we can do, but I think that the issues around something as basic as sycophancy and the fact that the LLM owners haven't managed to fix that yet is really interesting. So that explains why the pessimism at the same time. I think the tinkering is kind of startling. That as we learn from GitHub, the line between professional practitioner and customer or amateur user is really getting very blurred. And I'm finding stuff like, so I think it's fairly, so for example, two recent uses I've made of AI were helping me with organize an AWS deployment, which is something that previously I would have had a developer do for me, but in fact I did myself, and it was kind of painful because the AI kept getting it wrong and I had to keep going back again and saying, no, this didn't work because of this. So it was certainly cheaper, but I'm not sure whether it was that much faster than briefing somebody. Another example would be using AI scripting using AI to create scripts in Google Sheets, which is 100 times more powerful than most people realize. That stuff works really pretty amazingly well. So I think actually we should all aspire to be both optimists and pessimists and tinkerers.
Thank you. Let's shift gears a bit. Tim, you have been involved, and you've been involved not only in investing and sort of helping startups to grow and fund, but also in coaching CEOs at various stages. You know, drawing on your experience and drawing on your long history. What have you learned from coaching these founders, and what are you teaching them most of the time? What do you find is most prevalent?
Well, it's interesting. After the IPO of my company, I perhaps made the mistake that many people who've had a successful exit do of sort of smoking your own stuff and perhaps overestimating how much I knew. And therefore, when I started making investments, I often thought that I could give useful advice to founders about their products and what their roadmap should be and what their trajectory ought to be. And having observed the success rate of the advice and input that I gave was not very high, I realized that in fact that's perhaps not a very wise thing to do. And I think that if you're a founder and you have either outside investors or advisors, it's very important to realize that if you are spending 2 orders of magnitude, 100x, or perhaps even 3 orders of magnitude, 1000x, the time in thinking about your problems that those advisors are thinking, it would be very, very surprising if they can just walk in and say, oh, the answer's easy, you should do this. And therefore, my approach with CEOs, both as an investor and when I'm coaching them, is not to say, I know the answer to your problem and the answer is this. It's to do 2 things. One is to try to make sure that they have considered all the options that are in front of them. It's surprisingly common, and I'm sure all of you have noticed this in your lives, that when you talk to somebody about a challenge that they're facing, whether it's a work challenge or a personal life challenge, they will sometimes say, I've got to do A or I've got to do B. But actually there is often a C and maybe even a D or an E that they haven't considered. And I think that that getting to the best result often requires starting by making sure that you've considered all of those options. The other thing that I do when I'm coaching CEOs is that I tell them about similar situations I've seen with other startup founders and CEOs, what those people did and what the outcomes were. Many of you will have heard the phrase that you can learn by trial and error. I think the important thing is that trial and error is of course expensive because you devote resources to trying something, and if it fails, then you've lost those resources and now you have to try something else. It isn't always the case, but it's often the case that you can benefit from other people's trial and error without having to go through the cost again. So it will often be the case that you'll be facing a choice, you'll be facing a decision about what do I do, and there will be other people who've done a certain number of different things, none of which worked out or which had a very low success rate. And knowing about those can save you a huge amount of time. By the way, I wrote up many of the things that I learned from my first 1,000 coaching sessions with CEOs in a book which I've published on Amazon. It's not a for-profit enterprise because I've set the royalty rate to be 1 penny. So what I'm trying to do is not to make money from the book, but just to help people who are founders to, as it were, gather that knowledge as quickly as they can. And by the way, the reason it's a penny rather than 0 is because in order to fund Jeff Bezos' wedding, Amazon doesn't allow you to set a royalty rate of 0.
And what is it called? The book.
The book is called Startup 36 Lessons from Startup CEOs.
Yeah, look it up.
So it's things I learned from them, not things I propose to teach them.
Awesome. Let's shift tack. Let's go. Let's come back to the room and to Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe here. What would you, in a sort of very concrete fashion, what can you tell people in the audience and founders, how can they differentiate themselves coming from here? What would be strengths, weaknesses that they should lean into? Are there any storytelling or strategic gaps that you observe coming from this area versus the US or Western Europe? What can you tell people here?
Well, I would say this. 20 years ago, it was really pretty much unmistakable that if your only criterion was, how do I maximize the value of the business that I'm starting, then a very clear recommendation would be buy an air ticket to SFO and move now. That would be pretty much straightforwardly what you needed to do. And the reason was because, obviously, startup ecosystems contain a critical mass of things. They contain smart entrepreneurs, smart people you can hire, good investors, good professional services, whether it's recruiters or PR people or whatever. And if you go to a place that has a very strong critical mass, it is easy for you to put together a world-class business. What I would say is that the good news, if you're somebody who's living in Cluj or living in Europe, the good news is that improved communications technologies mean that information now travels much more quickly than it used to. When I was fundraising for my startup, I went to go and see, and this is in the first years of the commercial internet, I went to go and see a load of European VCs. And the key question that they all asked me was, what makes you think that anybody is going to use the internet for business or for buying or selling things? And I had been living in San Francisco, and I had been writing a column for the Financial Times about web business models until then. And to me, it was completely obvious that was not an open question. It was decided, as it were. It is that kind of gap of knowledge has mostly disappeared. And it is mostly the case now that the VCs in Munich or Berlin or Paris or London, broadly speaking, know as much as the VCs in New York or in Seattle or in San Francisco. Not 100% and not the best of them, but broadly speaking, the gap has narrowed very significantly. So what does that mean? It means that if you're doing a startup, you don't necessarily have to move. Obviously, when you look at the price of renting an apartment here versus renting an apartment on Mission in San Francisco, there's kind of a difference in pricing. And it's a lot more expensive to do a startup there. And therefore, when you look at the higher valuations and the higher amounts that you have to raise, you have to think of it, as an economist would say, on a purchasing power parity basis. It's all very well to raise 5 times as much money, but if when you build the startup, your costs are 4 times as much as they would otherwise be, then the differential looks less favorable. So I think, therefore, what that means is that the good news is that it's more exciting and the possibilities are greater to build a startup outside Silicon Valley than they used to be.
And do you think the sort of fragmentation of the European market and all these jurisdictions, which is clearly a disadvantage when you compare it to the US in terms of market sizing and regulations, do you think that kind of supersedes the advantage that founders have coming from here that immediately need to build for an international audience? They don't have the comfort of testing it, in their own home market as much because their home market might be too small. So they do have to look across. But, this kind of is being countered by the fragmentation. Which one do you think is kind of a stronger factor in building?
So that's super important. So obviously, as you know, the population of the EU is actually larger than the population of the United States, even though the per capita GDP is somewhat less. So it's not the markets are roughly comparable in size, and as you know, the US has a single federal government, whereas the government of Europe is not a single federal government. However, Europe does have a single market and does have freedom of movement of capital, goods, and people and services. In many respects, it's more fragmented here. The language is the most obvious. It used to be the case, in fact, I'm sure it still is the case, that the European Commission employs a few thousand people whose job is to translate the 20-odd different language pairs that are required for communication inside Europe. However, anybody who's looked at the improvements in translation and then the huge turbocharging in improvements driven by AI will of course realize that it is way easier to publish a business that has a web or mobile front end in multiple languages than it used to be. So therefore, the big advantage, which is let's do it in the US because we only have to do it in English and it's not so complicated as doing it in French and German and Italian as well, that disadvantage may have gone away. It's also worth realizing, of course, that things depend a lot on the industry. For example, I was involved a decade ago in a telemedicine startup, which was doing psychotherapy using psychologists in the US. I didn't know until that point that if you are living in New York and you are being treated by a psychologist in San Francisco, there's actually an important legal question there, because the state of New York will not allow you to be treated by someone out of state, and the state of San Francisco will not allow a psychologist in San Francisco to serve clients outside the state. So actually, it's not a simple yes-no answer. It depends quite a lot on the industry that you're in and what the issues are.
Thank you, Tim. I think I wanted to open it up maybe 5 more minutes to the audience. If anybody has questions to ask Tim, I think now would be the time.
Well, I'd actually love to ask. We can't see anybody in the audience yet, but I'd love to ask. Is anyone who's currently building a startup, how are they feeling that the fundraising is going? And what are their thoughts about communicating with investors right now? Because I think that's often the big constraint in building something. You can do something terrific with a couple of people free of charge in your spare time while you have a day job. But once you commit and you want to hire a team of people, then things are a bit different. I'd love to hear from people what they think about that.
Yeah, or look up Tim after when we're off stage. In terms of like we said, founders, developers, etc., that are present here, is there in terms of traits, in terms of we're talking about communication and so on, do you see much difference? Can you give something that you've observed in terms of personality traits, in terms of openness? We talked a lot yesterday about leaning in, going out, outgoing type of personalities, etc. That kind of important. Is that still as important and approaching you very sort of offensive and leaning in way, or is it enough to kind of submit an amazingly drafted deck? Or do you need that sort of personal?
I think many rookie venture capitalists are too focused on the product and the potential market. And about 8 years ago, I changed our approach very dramatically, and I also changed the name of our fund. It's now called Walking Ventures. For the following reason. I found that when I looked back and made an analysis of the investments that we'd made that had not been very successful, the single most common reason for lack of success was not to do with a mistake about the market or a mistake about whether the product would achieve product market fit. The issue was often to do with the capacity of the founders, and were the founders really strong enough to be able to build a great business? And what I realized was that I needed to change our due diligence approach as an investor to focus much more on the personalities of the founders and their life stories, to understand what kind of past experiences would inform how they would address the challenges that they faced. So I think that that resilience and persistence and an ability to be analytical rather than only emotional are hugely valuable in determining those outcomes.
Yeah. Good. We have 1 more minute. If any more questions, we're taking them. Otherwise, I think, thank you very much, Tim.
Well, Andreas, it's been great to be here, and there's a lot of exceedingly smart people here. And I think it's a very interesting reminder of two things. One is, the internationalization of talent and business.
Yes.
And the other, perhaps even more important, is the value of kind of working at it. Because if we look at what Vlad has done in building Techsylvania, this is really a tremendous place to be and a tremendous group of people. So thank you very much.
With that, thanks very much, Tim.